Welcome to Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young.
Hey everybody, welcome to an all-new episode of Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young that you see right there. I'm your host, Mike Leon. You know, Clarke is a seasoned family law attorney who represents the spouses of people who suffer from BPD in child custody proceedings, and he's going to explain what all that means in just a second. And in today's episode, Clarke's also going to introduce us to what he calls the Vampire Divorce, the self-titled name of this podcast. We'll explore what the three-letter acronym BPD is, how it shows up in relationships, and why these cases are unlike any other divorce. So, Clarke, good to see you first and foremost. Let's start with a high level. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this line of work?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. What brought me to this line of work was I was practicing law in Alaska for 15 years of my previous life, so to speak. My first 15 years of law practice, I was practicing land use law in Alaska. That was a lot of planning and zoning, municipal law, property disputes, neighbor disputes. I worked a lot with the municipality. Anything related to land, basically, real estate transactions, purchase and sale agreements, commercial leasing, all those kinds of things. And then I unwittingly married a woman who taught me everything I now know about borderline personality disorder. And at that moment, my entire life sort of went off on a tangent, and she gave me a new career, basically. So up until that point, I was doing very well in life. I was very happy, very successful. But after that point, as is true of many people who are in interpersonal relationships with borderlines, your life kind of goes to hell in a handbag. There are a lot of dynamics of that I'll get into later on. But just as part of my background, I just want people to understand that this is one of those things where I've been there, done that, and I've earned my golden spurs many times over on the subject. And that's really the background. I mean, my divorce raged for basically 15 years, and it just I had a court that didn't really understand anything about psychology, and in particular, probably didn't have an interest in knowing anything about borderline personality disorder in particular. So it's a uphill battle trying to get a custody proceeding resolved when everything in the system is set up, it seems, against you. The system does not reward normal behavior. It enables dysfunctional people to manipulate the system pretty well. So that's kind of how I got into this. And I'll just add as a footnote that it took a while, but I ended up getting sole legal and sole physical custody of my two children. And they were in my custody until they were adults, and then they went on to college, and they're about 32 and 34 right now. So it's been a long time that I've been involved in this. And since my own divorce, I've been doing nothing but cases where, as you said before, I'm representing spouses of people who suffer from borderline personality disorder in custody proceedings. So at the end of the day, I'm really trying to save children. I mean, that's the other thing I do.
Yeah. It's great. It's great to hear, and it's great work. We're going to get into a little bit more of your personal story, and I want to touch a little bit more, obviously, on BPD, which you just explained what the acronym means. But let me ask you first, at a high level, you started this podcast. What are some of your aims and goals around this podcast? You gave a little bit of the personal story, but what are some of the goals and aims that Clarke Young has for this podcast?
Well, first and foremost, it's to reach out to the hundreds of thousands of people who are in divorces or interpersonal relationships, fraternity cases or whatnot, where with a borderline. And most of those people have a very strong sense of something is wrong, but they don't have a label for it. They don't know what is really happening, and they're struggling. So that's one of my primary audiences. But in addition to that, there's also a lot of psychologists, healthcare practitioners of different kinds, with different backgrounds. Some, for example, may be involved in what in California we call child custody evaluations. And I've gotten a number of phone calls over the years from people who are asked to do child custody evaluations or reports to the court, and they're actually afraid to label the borderline and diagnose the borderline as a borderline because they're afraid of the retributions that will happen, and they will happen, if you ever suggest to a borderline that they're not perfect, because internally they know they're perfect, and if something goes wrong in the borderline universe, it can't be them. Logically, it can't be them because they know they're perfect. So it has to be somebody else to blame.
Right.
Somebody else has to be wrong. So that's the second sort of audience of the psychologists and healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
But above and beyond that, I don't think people are aware of how devastating a borderline is, not just to the nuclear family, but to the extended family and society at large. A fellow named Dr. Nathan Schwartz-Salant once wrote in a book called The Borderline Personality, Vision and Healings, that the borderlines are epidemic, and each generation begets more generations of borderlines. So it's sort of a cancer within the psychological community. And we'll get into this in more detail. I'm not going to say what I'm going to say in any detail right now, but when you have somebody whose approaches the world and problem solving and relationships based on control and power, manipulation, deceit, and ultimately subjugation to their will, they're going to show up in society in certain ways. And that has huge, for example, political consequences, because they are going to vote for political philosophies and ways of showing up in politics that are reflective of who they are as individuals. And that's a societal war, a cultural war that's going on. So that's another audience I would like to address as part of this.
Well, you touched on the detail part, so let's get into the detail part. What is BPD exactly? Borderline personality disorder. And also for that listener out there, how can they tell if they're in a relationship with someone who suffers or has BPD?
Well, there are three different ways we can talk about borderline personality disorder. One is in religious terms, one is in literary terms, and one is in psychological terms. And depending upon who I'm talking with, one of those frames of references will resonate more than the others. Probably the simplest one and the oldest one are really the religious notions. And in religion, borderlines, I guess you could say, are pure evil. When I say pure evil, I mean that most normal people have a conscience in which there's a debate about what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. But from a borderline's point of view, right and wrong and good and bad are really merely a manifestation of what their desires, their needs, and their wants are. That defines what is good and right. And they expect the entire world to serve that need or right, that need or desire whenever it changes, which happens every 10 minutes practically. So that's the sort of religious context you have. It's really in all the old scriptures, they're always talking about evil, and that's really someone who's based in power and control and subjugation and manipulation and tons of deceit, and they're basically manipulating people around them to control them and subjugate them. So that's sort of the religious notion. On the other end of the scale, the more modern approach is the psychological approach, and that's what you'll read if you Googled DSM-4 or DSM-5, borderline personality disorder. You would come up with a whole list of things where they describe it, and I just might read some of that just so people have that orientation. There are really 9 criteria that people look at, psychologists look at in diagnosing someone with borderline personality disorder. So the core wound in a borderline is their fear of being abandoned. And in the first criteria, it addresses that core wound. It's a frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Individuals with BPD intensely fear rejection and will go to great lengths to prevent perceived abandonment. Number two is a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. And so these relationships are characterized by alternating between idealization and devaluation with intense emotions that can shift rapidly. I could go into details on all these, but I'm just going to read through them briefly right now. Third is identity disturbance. This means that it's marked by persistent instability in their self-image or sense of self is unstable. The fourth criterion is impulsivity in at least two areas that are potentially self-damaging. So this can include things like binge spending or substance abuse, sex addiction, reckless driving, other risky sexual behavior, or binge eating. The fifth criteria is recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-mutilating behavior. And this can be a way to cope with intense emotional pain or to manipulate others. And I do want to emphasize that. Many times people think that if a borderline isn't manifesting some sort of self-harm intentions, that they're not borderlines. But you only need to fulfill 5 or 6 of these criteria in order to be diagnosed with borderline. And I have found that in many cases, borderlines aren't suicidal as long as they have a host that they're feeding off of, and they can maybe use the threat of suicide or self-harm as a way of manipulating the other person to do what they want them to do at that moment in time. So number 6 is it's an affective instability due to marked reactivity of mood. In other words, it's intense mood swings such as irritability, anxiety, dysphoria, and other things. And I've seen this often too, because sometimes psychologists will misdiagnose a borderline as being histrionic with some other comorbidities, but actually being histrionic and very dramatic and over-the-top emotionalism is one of the hallmarks of borderlines, especially when you defy their will and they have to turn up the heat on you to compel you to do what they want you to do. So number 7 is chronic feelings of emptiness. It's a pervasive sense of emptiness or hollowness. Number 8, inappropriate but intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. And this can manifest as frequent displays of temper, constant anger, or physical fights. This is where the physical violence comes in. And number 9, it's a transient stress-related paranoia ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And what this is this leads them to feel feelings of paranoia, or they get very delusional and detached from reality. So most of the borderlines that you deal with will end up having severe inabilities to relate to what's real, and they keep reinterpreting history and reinventing and rewriting history to comport whatever their present needs and desires are to manipulate others. So that's, I don't want to get into the DSM-5 anymore, but I've taken quite a bit of time just to go through those. I find for most cases, though, the most useful way for people to understand borderlines is that in literature for hundreds of years and in fairy tales for hundreds of years, these have been vampires. And the symbolism and the metaphors that are used are all very, very apropos. For example, the image of somebody who's a parasite who is sucking the life force, the blood, if you will, out of another person is a hallmark of borderline personality disorder. If you talk about holding up the cross, which is a symbol of truth, they're repelled by the truth. They don't want to hear about the truth. They're rejected by it. The idea that they work in the shadows and in the dark and at night and out of sight is very, very common with borderlines too. they present one public image which appears quite normal, but then in the privacy of your own home behind closed doors, you're living with a monster that no one would even recognize, and your friends would say, no, that's not who she is or who he is. Other symbolism is there. The idea of if they're exposed to sunlight, the light of day, they will sometimes, just crumble from the exposure. And that is one thing that vampires and borderlines really fear the most, is the idea of being exposed. They don't want to be exposed to their families, to their friends, to anybody, their employers. They like to work in the dark. So, winding up your question here, I find that for most people, they can relate readily to the vampire way of understanding what and who are borderlines and what they're up to and what they're trying to do. I mentioned before that it's about subjugating you to their will. And when a borderline wants to subjugate you to their will, it's not 80% or 90% or 99%. It's 100% subjugation. They actually believe that if you would just let them control you completely, that everything would be fine. And perhaps from their point of view, they actually delusionally think it would be, even from their point of view, but it never works out that way. So, and the last thing I'll say about vampires is, as we all know from watching all the movies, Bram Stokes and all the other ones, Dracula and all those, when you upset a vampire and you say to them, I want out of this relationship, they will destroy you, and they'll destroy you in any way they can. But basically, in a metaphorical sense, they will kill you. They'll suck out your life force and leave you for dead. So those are like the three perspectives for how potential clients and I talk about all of these different ways of discussing the borderline personality disorder. But what I'm trying to do is let them know that I want them to be able to identify what the problem really is, give them it a label so they can start reading about it and get up to speed on how to deal with it and how to protect and save their children. And then also how to show up in court and testify and bring in experts to testify that will help the court understand and help educate the court about what are the psychological dynamics driving the divorce. The problem that I have is that these cases are extremely expensive because it takes about 18 months of going into court every 3 to 5 months to educate the court before the court finally goes, what you said on day one is actually true. You weren't being you weren't blaming and making things up and just being histrionic yourself. You were just being descriptive when you were describing what your relationship is like with the borderline. So that's really basically why it's important for the viewers to understand, what they're going to be getting into, as well as what borderline is.
Yeah, Clarke, let's land the plane on this because you funneled into the follow-up perfectly. We talked about it in my introduction about how you're a family law attorney, right? And you help these folks in these child custody proceedings. So somebody that's watching, listening to this, you started this podcast to help inform the public. They're listening to this right now. They think that person is exhibiting those symptoms of, borderline personality disorder. What would be your recommendation to them? What would be your advice to them right now?
Great. So here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news first. The bad news is that the spouses of people who suffer from borderline personality disorder really do feel isolated. Most of them are suffering from PTSD because of the trauma of being in the relationship. And their psychological and emotional resources are already somewhat compromised to one degree or another, depending upon how long they've been in the relationship and how many situational stressors they've been dealing with and how frequently they're coming up. So when you're dealing with people who are coming into a situation like that, they need a lot of help. They need to be in counseling with somebody who specializes in helping the spouses or family members of a borderline, and they have to find an attorney, of which I know of almost none in the entire country who do what I do, who understand the psychological dynamics that are driving the divorce. Then they're going to have to deal with a judge who is too busy to actually look at any case in any great detail, and is probably already so emotionally bankrupt from listening to people's problems all day long that they don't want to get into the heavy lifting part of looking at the psychological evaluations of the parties, for example. So that's what, in answer to your question, they need to get a therapist, they need to get an attorney, they need to probably get some coaching. I mean, I'll say this, that I would like to reach a broader audience, and I've been able to litigating one case at a time. Because up to this point, I've only been able to litigate somewhere between 2 and 4 cases at a time. When before, when I was litigating what I call garden variety divorces, I could handle 20, 30 cases. And that's what most attorneys do. But that's not going to be your life if you're an attorney and watching this and you go down this path or you have a case like this. You're going to have to cut your workload in a quarter probably in order to handle 2 or 3 borderline cases. They're that intense.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do is reinvent myself, so to speak, and do more consultation so that if you are somewhere in the world, I've gotten calls from all over the world, and you don't know what's going on, your attorney doesn't know what's going on, and your case just keeps going down, the toilet, so to speak, you need to get in touch with me or someone like me. So that's the second thing. And the other option is I would like to be doing more expert witness work where I actually show up and testify as an expert or co-counsel on cases, but not the primary, seat number one. So that's the sort of help that I would say that most people in this situation need to get. And the last thing I'll add is that you need to start working with your family and friends because you will have been cut off from the herd. The borderline will have done everything to sever all your relationships with anybody who might be onto who they are or might support you in defending yourself against the borderline. So you don't want to be the Lone Ranger when you're in this situation. You need to build a team because teams win, and that's the bottom line.
Well, Clarke, we truly appreciate everything you've given us today, insights-wise. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
And thank you for everybody out there listening to today's episode of Vampire Divorce. In future episodes, we're going to explore various aspects of how to overcome the many barriers to justice in child custody proceedings, as well as discuss the larger picture of how and where BPDs show up in the world. Do me a favor, please subscribe to get notifications of when new episodes are posted. Forward this link to someone that you know that may need to listen to it. You'd be surprised at how many people find this seemingly esoteric subject fascinating. You can find Clarke over at clarkeyoung.com if you want to go visit him. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.